Hi, Jamie Edwards from jamieedwards.com, and today I'd like to talk to you about development environments and how you can use them to isolate your customers from the changes you're making to your software. You know, early in my career, I was just learning to write code and how to actually build software, and I didn't think much about how I needed to actually get those changes out to customers. You know, if you go back about 20 years ago when I started my career, there was much less maturity in how changes were rolled out to customers, and every company kind of had a different way of doing it. You know, even when I moved to Austin about 10 years ago, I had some clients that I did work for that actually their developers would make changes to the product, and when they thought those changes were ready for customers, they would just immediately roll them out straight into production. Now, for some companies, a solution like this for rolling changes out might work. You might have a very small, tightly knit team, and you may not need all the process rigor and separate environments that a larger software company needs. But I find most companies need a minimum of 3 separate environments when developing software. So let's talk a little bit about those. The first environment is the development environment, and that's really the title of this video. So the development environment is a place where a software developer or an engineer can actually work on the software in isolation from where customers are using it. If you think of people that work at Google, Apple, YouTube, or Facebook, when they're actually making changes to one of those popular sites that you use, those changes are not being made right at Facebook.com or Google.com. Rather, an engineer is actually writing code on his computer, and somewhere that code he's writing, he can basically hit play or start or begin looking at it and inspecting the changes he's making. And those changes look like they're running on Facebook.com or look like they're running on Google.com, but they're really running in a development environment. So one of the first things as a company that you need to decide when you're going to do software development in a more professional manner and hopefully eventually lead to things like continuous delivery and DevOps, which I talked about in the video yesterday, is what's our strategy for giving developers an environment to do work separate from customers? So in some companies, if you're building, let's say, a simple website that just has a database, a development environment might be as simple as a copy of a database and a version of the website that a developer can run on his or her own computer. And in most companies, many of the ones I work for, this is typically sufficient. In a larger company, though, or a product that's much more sophisticated and has many more moving parts, a developer may need 5, 10, 15 large components to all be running at the same time to do development. Things like maybe there's 3 or 4 websites that they need to have all running just to test their change. They may have multiple APIs that need to be running. They may need multiple databases and maybe things like SAP or PeopleSoft or CRM systems that aren't the production system that customers hit, but a separate copy just for them. Now, with the advent of cloud technology, where you can go up to Amazon Web Services or Windows Azure or Heroku or different sites like this, some companies are starting to create development environments in the cloud. So you as a developer, when you're going to start to do work, rather than pulling the code down on your own computer and making changes there, your code actually gets placed up in the cloud somewhere, meaning up somewhere on the internet in a special holding place that's just there for you to do your work. Now, there's no real preference I have to either one. If I were to go into a company that was asking me to help them with DevOps or continuous delivery today, I would really look at their team size. I would look at how frequently they're releasing the product. I'd look at the infrastructure of their product. How complicated is it? How many moving pieces are there? And then I would really decide what's appropriate to recommend to them. And oftentimes when I go into a company and they want help with this, they may need no help with isolating the environment. They've already got that handled. So that's the development environment, the first of these that you really need to think a little bit on your software project about. How do I create an environment or a playground or a place for my developers to make changes separate from customers in production? The second of these three environments that I recommend most companies have is a user acceptance test environment. Sometimes this can also be known as a staging environment or simply a QA or test environment. And really this environment is another holding place, another copy of the application, but developers aren't making changes to it, minute by minute, and it's not where customers are, it's sort of in the middle. And the purpose of this environment is typically to run more exhaustive testing. Now, companies that are doing more manual testing that haven't really achieved, continuous delivery and automated deployment, and some of the things I talked about in the video yesterday, a version of the software getting ready for release may sit in that test environment for an extended period of time and get heavily manually tested before it's released to its users. In a more automated environment where there are changes being pushed out to production through automation, it may, a build of the software with changes in it may go into the test environment and have a series of automated tests run on it that may take 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe an hour, and it's essentially good to go and ready to progress out to customers in production. So that's the test environment or the QA environment. It's again a copy of the code that developers have already worked on. They believe that it may be ready for production and it may be ready for customers, but the term in continuous delivery is they promote it. They say, I've been working on, let's say, version 3 of the code, this new version. And maybe what's in production is version 1. It's the oldest, the original version of the code. And they're thinking version 3, I think, might be ready for customers. So they put version 3 in the test environment. So then they can get working on version 4 or 5 or 6, a newer version. And now the test environment's sitting there at version 3, ready for people to test or automated tests to run against. The third of these environments is the one that I talked about a lot yesterday, which is the production environment. The environment where customers are actually going to go to use your product. Now that environment typically is managed or at least overseen by people with an operations skill set. However, depending on your company structure, you may have engineers that have both operations and development skill sets. And so you may have the same people that are writing the code pushing changes out into production. Really, that's up to the structure of your team, your company, your quality assurance process, and the stack of technologies you're using to get releases out. So those are sort of the three minimal environments that I recommend most companies consider using when releasing their software. The development environment where developers make changes, the test environment or user acceptance test environment or staging environment where a build is looked at a little more critically to get ready to, give it basically a go or a no-go to go into production, and then production. Now on top of that, there's two other environments that I commonly run into that sometimes make sense. One of these environments is a demo environment, a place where I can put a copy of the application to demo it to customers or possibly other people in the business without disrupting the process that development's using to get changes out to customers. So if you have a demo environment, what you put in the demo environment is usually sort of a standalone copy of the application or the services, and you're letting people go in there and really not test it for the purposes of quality, but just look at it, inspect it, see what it looks like, see if it's if it's going in the right direction before customers even see it. So that's the demo environment. One other environment I often see used is a capacity testing environment. And this environment is meant to actually stress test the software and see how it's performing under load and if there's going to be any issues. When we think of running a software product in production, if I have a website, let's say, that has millions of visitors per day, the server or the computing processing power that may be up in the cloud or something like that, or in a data center, typically has to be pretty powerful to handle a large volume of users. And to be more powerful, it's going to cost more money. So most companies can't afford, let's say it takes, 15 servers. There may be Linux servers up in the cloud or in a data center, or they're, Windows servers in a sort of more of a .NET type of an environment. Most companies can't afford 15 servers as their test environment and another 15 for their developers and another 15 for demo, right? So the capacity test environment, though, does need to represent as close as possible the real processing power of production, because a capacity test environment's purpose is we as a team are going to run tests against it to simulate a real load of users. So if your application in production, for example, is getting, let's say, 500,000 hits a day, and that has 15 servers to support that, if you choose to do capacity testing, you want an additional 15 servers that can also be hit with usually automated tests. So I talked about this yesterday in the continuous delivery video. Some tests that somebody has written that says, I want you to hit this website in the same way that users would and create the same traffic that we would get in the real world so that people can measure the performance. Things like, how much is the processor being taxed? Is memory okay? Are the hard drives getting hit really hard? Now, I'm talking a lot about a web application here. If you're building an API, you're going to run into a similar thing. You may have an API that your product offers, and maybe that's how you make money. You have customers out there who are third parties, and they're paying you to use your service out on the internet, and they're actually making API calls to you. Well, if your production environment for your API has, let's say, 5 to 10 servers, again, if you want to do capacity testing, you want your capacity testing environment to have the same horsepower or the same processing power as your production environment. So that's it today. I wanted to give you a quick run through on what different development environments are and how you use them to actually progressively get your releases of software closer to your customers. Tomorrow I'll talk about configuration management and how we actually make sure that when we roll changes out into these different environments, we don't accidentally have copies of the code pointing to things in the wrong environment. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks.